Okay, I think it's about time to get started. We want to make sure to respect everyone's time here and keep this to 30 minutes. So thank you for attending this webinar, part of Bowermaster and ESM's monthly series on current topics that are affecting our clients. Today's education will be centered on the dreaded OSHA unannounced visit and more broadly on what you need to be sure that you've got in place for preparation for that OSHA visit, whether it's announced or unannounced. Side note, if questions pop up for you during this presentation, please feel free to ask them via the chat box on your screen. Due to time constraints and again, respecting everyone's time, we won't be answering the questions today, but all the questions will be answered in a follow-up email that goes out after the webinar is concluded. That'll include a copy of the slides and also a link to the video in case you'd like to rewatch. And lastly, we encourage feedback for future topics, as our goal in this whole monthly series is to provide a resource that's educational and can ultimately positively affect your bottom line as an organization. In the case of today's topic, probably help you sleep a little better at night knowing your business is in the right place when it comes to OSHA regulations. So let's jump into our presenter. I could talk about myself, but Anthony is the more handsome one on the screen there. So I'd like to dive into him anyway. Bowermaster and ESM's partnership goes back about a decade, and Anthony Poston is one of the founders at ESM Solution, and his knowledge is really unparalleled within his field. Anthony deals with Bowermaster clients and potential clients on projects that identify areas that create the financial drain, mainly in safety and workers' compensation and cost containment. And his results speak for themselves as he's developed unique customized plans that have achieved the overriding goals of creating a safer work environment and ultimately reducing costs and the total cost of risk. So with that, I'll hand it over to your presenter for the day, Anthony Poston. Take it away, my friend.
Hey, thanks, Corey. I am honored to be a partner with Bowermaster. You guys do an excellent job, and kudos to hosting these webinars because I think we have close to almost 90 people registered for today. So definitely a hot topic, and I really appreciate the partnership that we have formed over the last decade. So let's dive right into this presentation. We have a lot of material to cover. And although these two subjects have a broad range of various rules and best practices, today we're going to stay really high level to make sure that we get everybody out in about 30 minutes. So I'm going to start with a rhetorical question. Does your company have the tools to comply with applicable Cal-OSHA standards? And there are probably additional, a dozen different government regulations that you need to be concerned with, but Cal-OSHA standards have an impact on our business on a daily basis. So who is Cal-OSHA? And most of you know from various experiences or stories who Cal-OSHA is, but I wanted to share their mission statement, which I'm going to read. Cal-OSHA is the California state program responsible for protecting the health and safety of workers. Cal-OSHA makes sure that employers follow occupational safety and health regulations and keep the workplace safe. Almost all workers in California are protected by Cal-OSHA regulations, often called standards. Now, you'll note I highlighted a section in the middle of that statement, and it has an underlying assumption that you, the employer, know and follow OSHA standards, which is why I asked the question in the previous slide. Unfortunately, Cal-OSHA is considered by most employers as an adversary because when they show up at your door, it's not typically a friendly visit. They're not asking if you want to go get beers after work. They are enforcement officers, and as such, they have a significant amount of power. So my recommendation, if you get nothing else out of this presentation, is do the right thing and then be sure to document what you've done. Now, if Cal-OSHA shows up, a citation or a fine or a fix-it ticket may be inevitable, but if you do the right thing and you have proof that you did it, that citation is going to be minimal and the officer is going to be more lenient. And of course, I say that with a grain of salt because it will also depend on why OSHA is there at your office to begin with. Now, another thing I want to point out is that Cal-OSHA standards are for the most part more stringent than Fed-OSHA or any other state OSHA program. So essentially, if you're complying with Cal-OSHA, you're complying with the majority of other state and Fed-OSHA standards. And if your business is domiciled in California, but you do work in other states, I would recommend that you make an attempt to learn some of the nuances of other state OSHA programs. And I'll give you an example. For construction employers doing work in Nevada, your workers and supervisors are required to have an OSHA and 10-hour 30 certification. So there's probably additional blue sky laws in each state, and it's important that you have knowledge of those as well as comply with them, which is, again, what is expected from Cal-OSHA per this mission statement. All right, what you've all been dreading. There's a call from your front desk or your job site foreman. OSHA's here. Now what? So let's talk about Cal-OSHA. There are two sides. There is enforcement and there's consultation. And you can see here in this slide what each division focuses on. Now, primarily, enforcement is going to respond to a complaint, a serious injury, or some other instance where there's an exposure and it could result in an injury to an employee. And there's actually a former Cal-OSHA enforcement officer in Los Angeles who was a real-life Columbo. He worked for the division for 35 years, and we would actually have him present at a lot of events because he would literally tell the audience that he would play dumb. He'd try to trip up the employer on any gaps in what they said versus what was actually being practiced in the field. And most importantly, if he found the employer to be misleading, in his words, he would roll on you. But if he recognized that the employer was being transparent, he was more willing to work with them rather than roll all over him. Now, Cal-OSHA consultation supposedly is your friend. But regardless, one thing I don't recommend is inviting the fox into the hen house. So even if you have an excellent safety program, you don't need Cal-OSHA consultation to come out and verify it because they will find a technicality. That's their job. So something to note for you construction companies, you might work on a project where the general contractor is part of the Cal-OSHA partnership program. And that's very common with big GCs, big clients, big projects. And in that case, you want to make sure you have your policies, your training, and your documentation in order. Because during a routine inspection as part of that partnership program, your company could be selected for an audit at random. So definitely something to consider when you know that your general contractor is part of the partnership program. All right, so why would OSHA show up unexpectedly? And here are the 5 reasons. 1, there is an imminent hazard that they have been made aware of. 2, there's a fatality or there's a major catastrophe. And unfortunately, we here at ESM, we deal with an average of 4 to 5 death claims a year. And those take an enormous financial and emotional drain on the entire organization. And in Southern California, in cases of serious injury or death, OSHA could bring the district attorney along with them to look for criminal charges. All right, number 3, investigation of serious injury or exposure. If you know that you have a serious exposure, it is imperative that you have a policy and training as well as documented enforcement around that policy. And I'm going to share a quick example in an upcoming slide about not having these and how costly it can be. Number 4, formal complaints. This is probably the most common, and I'm going to give you a quick story. Jamba Juice was a client of ours, and one of their 18-year-old summer workers sliced off the very tip of her finger when she was using the orange slicer. The manager took her to the clinic, but that was apparently not enough because her mom called Cal-OSHA, who showed up at their store almost immediately. Ultimately, they were issued a $5,000 fine because they did not call Cal-OSHA within the 8-hour requirement. The injury was considered an amputation and thus categorized as serious. And then subsequently, Cal-OSHA fined them $18,000 for the serious injury and then another $5,000 for not having an injury and illness prevention program. So all in total, $28,000 in fines from that one, what they thought was a very minor injury. So the moral of that story is just don't piss moms off. All right, number 5, scheduled inspections. That's usually of a business with an XMOD of greater than 125%. And a side note on that last bullet, Cal-OSHA's High Hazard Employer Program, it used to be called the Targeted Inspection and Consultation Fund, or the TICF. Under that program, employers with XMODs of 125% or more were issued a fine based on their payroll and then potentially subject to an OSHA inspection. They have since replaced that program by adding a small cost to employers' workers' comp premiums, but Cal-OSHA may still send you a letter which will come from the consultation division asking for reasoning as to why your XMOD is over 125%. And then based on your answer, they could respond with a scheduled time to come out and inspect your facility. or you may never hear from them again. They're kind of funny that way. All right, let's spend a few minutes to talk about your plan for when they show up. And most importantly, have a plan. After this presentation, we are going to send out the presentation, the slides of this deck, and also our guidelines for unexpected visits by a Cal-OSHA representative, which you can see in a screenshot on the right side of the screen there. But here are a few highlights. One, as I mentioned, have a plan. You can use ours or you can customize one for yourself. Two, they're going to ask to see various documents, including your IIPP and probably other training records. So be sure to have some form of document control system in place so that you can quickly access those. They're also going to present their credentials. And of course, this should go without saying, but you want to be hospitable. Being defensive is only going to set the wrong tone, and I would advise you not to turn them away because they will go back and get a subpoena. They'll come back with their posse and they'll be ready to battle. So if possible, take them to a closed room, a conference room, a job site trailer, somewhere where they don't have a line of sight to your production area. You don't want them ringing up additional violations in the back of their mind while they're there for a specific reason. The next bullet, you want to make sure that you identify the top 3 highest ranking individuals in the company or on your job site and ensure one of them is the primary point of contact. You may also need to provide training to your workers because remember what I said about that enforcement officer trying to trip up employers. If you have a lower level employee interfacing with the OSHA rep, even just for a few minutes, it's probably not going to go good. And you're going to need to have someone that's a little more polished and able to answer questions directly. And that leads me to the next bullet, which is do not divulge more than they ask for. Now, comparatively, if the IRS wanted to audit your 2017 taxes, you don't proudly give them 2015, 2016, and 2017, basically giving them carte blanche to audit away. You only want to give them what they ask for. And that reminds me that if your IIPP is 100+ pages, which I see commonly, when you hand it to them, because they're going to ask for it when they show up, you better be sure that everything in that document accurately reflects your operational practices. And giving you an example from that same enforcement officer I mentioned before, he was auditing an employer's IIPP program, and it stated in their personal protective equipment policy, their PPE policy, that all employees will wear hard hats. So he walked into their administrative office and said, I don't see all of the employees in these cubicles wearing hard hats. Now that seems kind of silly, but in his eyes, it meant that they are not in compliance with their own policies. And not to mention that he just asked for their injury and illness prevention program, which should be probably 8 to 10 pages. So the fact that they had their PPE policy inside their IIPP also just gave them more exposure to OSHA criticism. And lastly, respond within the time frame identified on any letter or citation you receive. If it's coming from Cal-OSHA consultation and you don't respond timely, they can officially hand it over to enforcement, and that's when they show up and can start issuing citations and fines and so forth. All right, that was just a real high-level overview of what to do when OSHA shows up, and we're going to send you these forms and this documentation after this presentation so you can dive into it a little bit deeper. But the rest of this presentation, we're going to focus on the OSHA 300 log and how to properly complete it because this subject is very timely. Okay, I added this very simple diagram from Cal-OSHA, which is a decision tree on when you are required to record the injury on your OSHA 300 form. And you'll see that it starts at the top. Did the employee get injured? And was it work-related? If it's a new case, does it meet the recording criteria of the OSHA 300, which we're going to discuss in a second? And if it does, then you record the injury or illness. And again, this is about as simple as a diagram as there is. And there are so many more nuances, and we're going to discuss some of those in the upcoming slides. Okay, as you should be aware, the OSHA 300 log has to be posted from February 1st to April 30th, which means right now. And it must include the total number of job-related injuries and illnesses that occurred in 2017. So that means everyone on this call, unless you are in the insurance or financial industry, so Bowermaster and ESM are excluded, your OSHA 300A should be posted in a conspicuous location for employees to see it. And I get asked frequently how long the records need to be maintained. And typically I recommend maintaining them for 5 years. But I provided the link to the form, which is in an Excel format. and I recommend you complete it electronically. And that way you can store them forever, and then you can also use the forms and the data to extrapolate trends, and that can help you set goals, and I'm going to share how to do that in an upcoming slide. All right, now there are several exemptions, but this is the primary one, and that is if you have 10 or less employees, which includes temp employees that were supervised on a day-to-day basis, then you must complete the log. I'm sorry, if you have 10 or more employees, you must complete the log. So if you have 10 or less, you are exempt. You do not have to complete this log. So something to consider, if you have 10 or less employees, even if you had temp employees last year, but you're under the count of 10, you do not have to complete the log. Okay, here are some did you know facts that we get asked frequently. First, yes, citations and inspections are public record and can be accessed at the OSHA website under that link at the top of the slide. And I did a quick analysis and found that between the Long Beach, Fremont, and Sacramento enforcement offices, combined there are more than 500 inspections or citations a month. So between just those three offices, there are more than 6,000 citations and or inspections a year. And that's only 3 of the 17 offices. So extrapolated out, I estimate that there's probably more than 20,000 inspections or citations a year. So Cal-OSHA is out in force. You don't want to give them a reason to come knocking on your door. As I mentioned before, there's a $5,000 fine issued to employers that have a serious injury and do not call Cal-OSHA within the 8-hour time frame. And if you want to know the definition of serious, you can visit our website under our blog section, and we've defined how Cal-OSHA defines the term serious. And something to note is that the paramedics and the emergency rooms have protocols to report serious injuries if they are known to be work-related. So if you have a serious injury and the employee is taken by ambulance or to the emergency room, it's more than likely that these providers are going to call Cal-OSHA. So it is much better that they hear from you, the employer, rather than one of those providers. Or worse yet, like I mentioned before, an employee's mom, which we saw did not end well for that employer. So here's another tidbit. At the end of the calendar year, when you're reviewing your OSHA 300 log, you can compare it to your work comp loss runs. If you do get your loss runs, if you don't, request them from your Bowermaster advisor, and then you can cross-reference your OSHA 300 form to your loss runs. Now, remember that medical only and indemnity claims that are on your loss runs, they should probably match up with your OSHA 300 log. And some carriers categorize first aid injuries as medical only claims, so you're going to have to know which ones are actually first aid and which ones are medical only. And if you sent the employee to the clinic, the doctor's first report in that box first aid, it will be checked, and then it is in fact a first aid injury. If it's not checked, it's more than likely going to be a medical only and beyond first aid, which would mean it's recordable. But typically first aid injuries and even most medical only claims, they don't result in lost time. So they don't require modified duty if you have a return to work program. So for construction employers, this shouldn't impact your DART rate, since those incidents don't result in days away or days restricted or transfer days as defined on your OSHA 300. Okay, I brought up first aid in the last slide because first aid injuries are not recordable. So OSHA defines first aid in 14 different ways, which you can find on page 3 of the Form 300. And I've added a screenshot to the right side in that red box. And then the California Labor Code defines first aid injuries as a one-time treatment and any follow-up visit for the purpose of observation of minor injuries, which are listed on the left side of the screen under that California Labor Code 5401. So again, first aid injuries are not recordable. And here are a few more frequently asked questions that we get frequently. And at the very bottom, there's a link to more FAQs, so I encourage you to visit that link if you have additional questions. But here's 3 of the top ones that we get. Is there a limit to the number of days away from work I must count? And yes, you may cap the total days away at 180 calendar days. Now, if a case occurs in 1 year but results in days away during the next calendar year, do I have to record the case in both years? No, you do not. You only record the injury or illness once. Now, if the employee is still away from work because of the injury when you prepare your form, you're going to estimate the total number of calendar days you expect the employee to be away from work up to the 180-day cap. So for example, if the employee is injured in December and you anticipate the employee being off work for 3 months, You expect him back March 1st. Then you're going to add the total number of days away, starting with the date of injury through February 28th. And you're going to use calendar days. Now, if the employee heals quickly and comes back to work sooner than the estimated days away, go back and change the log to reflect the accurate number of days off. And again, if you're using that Excel 300 form, then it's really easy to do. And for construction employers, this is really important because it will affect your DART rate. So it's important to go back and make that change. Now, this question I have been getting frequently: do we have to upload our Cal-OSHA 300 forms? And the unequivocal answer is no. And you can see here in this slide, I put a link to the Department of Industrial Relations website where it actually defines what employers have to do. In California, we do not have to upload our OSHA 300. And I'll read it. California employers are not required to follow the new requirements and will not be required to do so until substantially similar regulations go through formal rulemaking, which would culminate in adoption by the Director of the Department of Industrial Relations and approval by the Office of Administrative Law. You gotta love government regulations and how they talk. But again, the answer is no. You do not have to upload the Cal-OSHA 300 form. Okay, so what if you have multiple permanent offices? And the OSHA rule is that if you have multiple permanent offices, you must maintain a log at each of these different locations. However, you are allowed to maintain one log at your main office, given you can comply with these two rules. Number one, injuries that occur at other locations must be reported to the main office and recorded on the OSHA 300 log within 7 days. Number two, each office must also be able to generate that specific location's log within 4 hours. So if an OSHA rep asks to see your 300 log in Nevada and you're domiciled in California, you must be able to provide that log to that office within that 4-hour time frame. So nowadays, with all of our instant access and cloud solutions, you could easily set up a Dropbox folder that's shared amongst all the offices and then store this form and others so that each office is working from that same centralized system, which goes back to my document control point earlier in this presentation. All right, now that you've completed your OSHA 300 log, you've tallied the total number of days away from work, you are then putting that on your 300A, and you're posting that 300A now in a conspicuous location. Now, with this number of days away from work, you can estimate how much temporary disability was paid on your claims last year. And those TD dollars, those temporary disability dollars, directly impact your experience modification rate, or your XMOD. They also impact your workers' compensation premiums. So remember this note: it is the dollars that have an impact on your XMOD, and when you have lost days, you are incurring temporary disability costs, which is impacting your XMOD and impacting your workers' compensation premiums. So we use an average of $100 per day temporary disability rate. So if you multiply the number of lost days that you've had by $100, you can then estimate how much TD you paid last year. And in this case, this employer paid $69,000 in temporary disability. They had 690 lost days. That $69,000 goes directly into the formula for calculating your XMOD and your workers' comp premiums. And for many small employers, that could have a major impact on the XMOD. So digging a little deeper, I recommend you look at the past 5 years and then how much temporary disability did you pay on average? You can then use that number to help set a goal for 2018 and subsequent years. So by reducing the number of lost days, you're going to effectively reduce the dollars that impact your XMOD and ultimately the dollars that impact your workers' compensation premiums. Starting next month, ESM and Bowermaster, we're going to start hosting a series of return to work webinars where we're going to discuss how you can reduce temporary disability costs and lost days via a modified duty and an effective return to work program. Okay, it never fails that each year one of our clients receives this letter from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS. And what it is that each year the BLS, which is part of the Department of Labor, just like OSHA, they send out a letter to a small sample of employers across the US. They require those employers to submit their OSHA 300 log to the BLS electronically, which contradicts what I mentioned earlier about how California employers are not required to upload their OSHA 300 log. But this is a specific initiative initiated by the BLS, excuse me. And while it can seem alarming, it is a requirement. It's a required by law initiative. So you can see on the right side in bold letters, your response is required by law within 30 days. However, even though it's alarming, it's not going to have an impact on you. The BLS aggregates industry statistics based on this sample of employers that they pull from nationally, and it's about 200,000 employers across the nation. So yes, you're required to submit this by law, but no, they do not share this information with any other departments, specifically OSHA. This is simply a data aggregator where they use this collected data to calculate the incident rates from which you can then compare your company's results to. A funny thing about this, I had an employer ask me the other day, what would happen if I didn't comply and upload my 300 form? And that actually stumped me because there's no explanation as to what will happen. And honestly, I don't know any employer that has never not complied, especially since it's required by law, which states it in big bold letters. And really, there's no reason not to do it. So, excuse me, if you receive this letter and you choose not to respond, you're going to have to let us know if you get raided by OSHA or Homeland Security or the FBI or something, because that's going to help us solve that riddle. And it's going to make for a great story in a future webinar. All right, I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide, but if you are curious how to calculate your incident rate, as I mentioned before, you can do so here. This is actually taken straight from the OSHA 300 form, as is the DART formula. And if you do calculate your incident rate, you can then go to the BLS and you can compare it to the national average for your industry based on those statistics that have been aggregated. So again, this is just another opportunity to set goals and then benchmark your results against industry statistics. And you can access that link at the very bottom of that slide on the right side. Okay, I reviewed this example in last month's webinar, but since we're talking about OSHA visits and we have some new members in the audience, let's just quickly revisit this example of how an injury can impact an employer from a Cal-OSHA standpoint. And I'm going to be transparent that this is a bit of a fear factor approach, but it's meant to get you motivated to take action, because most of our clients call us after the fact, after the incident occurred, after their X-mod went up 20 points, after Cal-OSHA showed up or sent them a threatening letter. Very few employers take a proactive approach, which is really what safety is all about, prevention. So in this example, an employer with 35 employees and about 1.7 million in payroll had a forklift driver get out of the forklift while it was in operation to reposition some of the material on the forks while the forklift was moving forward. The employee slipped between the forks, got pinned between the material, and ultimately the forklift collided with a wall that resulted in a very serious injury to the employee. So let's take a look at the breakdown of the ensuing Cal-OSHA costs associated with this injury. Now, due to the nature of this injury, it was deemed serious by OSHA. And again, I encourage you to learn how OSHA defines the term serious. So citation number 1, failure to report. This employer did not call Cal-OSHA within 8 hours per the reporting standard, which is an automatic $5,000 fine. Citation 2, failure to train. Although this employer said that they had trained their forklift drivers, there was no proof, no documentation, no proof that this employee was qualified to operate the forklift. So again, no documentation to support the claim that he was trained, and that resulted in a $550 fine. Citation number 3, lack of a program. This employer did not have a forklift program which would define the qualifications of the drivers as well as the training requirements, and that fine ended up being almost $5,000. Citation number 4, failure to operate. Since this was a serious injury, the employer did not have a plan or any documentation, anything related to training on this forklift. In OSHA's eyes, they failed to administer a safety program, and that resulted in $14,000 in fines. So as you can see, the additional citations and penalties combined to a total amount of almost $25,000, and that is direct costs, not including the indirect costs of having to deal with the emotional issues with the employee being injured, and that employee being a long-term employee and how that impacted the rest of the organization. And then also from an OSHA defense, they had to hire an OSHA defense firm to come in and help work through these violations. So all those indirect costs really ratcheted up the overall cost of this citation. And that also didn't include the workers' comp costs, which the mod jumped up significantly and increased their workers' comp premium by almost $100,000. So in last month's webinar, we reviewed the impact of this one claim on the employer's XMOD and their workers' comp premiums. It was significant. So if you are interested, be sure to go back, review that webinar, and you can get the rest of the story. Okay, we've covered a lot of material, and I have 2 more slides before I turn it back to Corey to close out. And I encourage you to go back with your team and ask them these questions. How do we mitigate risk today and in the future? Are we in, excuse me, are we in compliance with industry regulations? And then what is our plan? Do we have one? Last month's webinar, we talked about developing your risk management plan. So again, I encourage you to go back, review that webinar if you haven't seen it. For those of you who have attended, my question to you and your team is, what did you do differently from last month's webinar to this one that moved the needle forward on your safety program? And then can you measure it? So whenever you do something, you want to be able to measure it to determine whether or not we are on the right path. If not, we can pivot and start looking at additional strategies or initiatives that are going to help us achieve our overall plan or our goals for the year. Okay, I mentioned in last month's webinar that we have developed a comprehensive risk management program that helps you focus on controlling your XMOD and your workers' compensation costs, as well as complying with Cal-OSHA standards. And since we had close to 100 people on today's webinar or registered, I'm going to make an assumption that almost all, if not most of the employers on this call have had injuries and they are managing them. Why else would you be interested in today's webinar topics, right? So that being the case, I ask each of you, and if you don't have the answer, I encourage you to go back and discuss this with your teams. But what is your budget for safety? And then how is that allocated? So considering workers' comp premiums can be the second leading expense behind payroll, it would be justified to have a plan and a budget to execute the initiatives you need to prevent injuries. Don't think that workers' compensation insurance is just a cost of doing business. Corey and I can both tell you from years of experience in working with employers, becoming complacent in your safety program can only hurt you on the back end when you start to have a string of injuries and your XMOD and your workers' comp premiums go sky high. And most of the time, that's when we get called, is to come in and try to fix it. Rarely do we get called on the preventative side where we're trying to prevent that from happening. So after 13 years of building and modifying these tools with over 1,000 employers ranging from 10 to 10,000 employees and in roughly over 30 industries, we've established a program that encapsulates all of these tools, these policies and procedures you're going to need to both become compliant with Cal-OSHA, as well as efficient workers' compensation administrators. So as I mentioned before, if you have an IIPP of 100 plus pages, let's schedule a demonstration where we can strategize on your risk management plan and what resources you're going to need in order to achieve your goals. We can tailor a demo for our program on how this can help accelerate both compliance as well as help you achieve your goals long-term, as well as creating a sustainable risk management strategy. And if nothing else, after that call, you'll at least have a plan on which you can execute. So contact your Bauer Master Advisor and again, start moving the needle forward on your risk management efforts. And just a side note, for being a Bauer Master client, we do offer this program at a pretty significant discount, which you can see on the right side. And just one more side note, 3 of my more labor-intensive clients, they all have mods of 175%, whereas one of them has a 214% mod. Whereas years ago, they were at about 100%. So they've essentially increased their workers' compensation premium by 2x. And there are several reasons that are driving that, but primarily it's because they just got complacent with their safety efforts. They had a few bad years with a string of injuries, and now their workers' comp premiums are sky high, and it's really tough for them to get a good insurance carrier. So be on the preventative side, prevent injuries so that you don't have to deal with the negative side of workers' compensation. Okay, so that concludes my preaching for the day. I'm going to get off my soapbox and I'm going to turn it back to Corey to close out. So thank you again, everybody, for the time. Corey, I'll throw it back to you.
Thanks a lot, Anthony. We really appreciate you taking the time to educate all those on the line about this the important rules and regulations of OSHA and what to do. And, you know, going back to his case study slide, as your insurance broker, we focus on areas where we can control, because that's, you know, essentially the job is to reduce overall costs. And the experience modification is a really good example. But in addition, understanding what is required by OSHA in the event of a serious injury is another really good example, because in his case study, you're looking at $25,000 in fines that could have easily been avoided just by knowing the rules and regulations. Obviously, you don't want that type of injury, but should it happen, knowing what to do is huge. I mean, $25,000 of basically wasted capital. If you look at it a different way, if your company's profit margin is at 10%, that's an additional $250,000 in revenues you need to generate just to make up that cost. So, you know, we really appreciate you guys coming on here. And in our, as he mentioned earlier, our next two webinars are focusing on return to work. March 21st, you can see the date, same time, same place, at your desk. And there'll be a half hour. Sorry, ran a couple minutes over today, but it's just so interesting, this OSHA stuff. So, you know, in return to work, I will say these are extremely important as a broker when we're out, you know, hunting the marketplace for workers' compensation. One of the first questions an underwriter asks is, what's their return to work program? And when we have a lot of information to back it up, said that our clients have X, Y, and Z set up for their return to work, and they offer modified duty, guaranteed 10 times out of 10 that results in higher credits and lower costs to you just by having this in place, not to mention the good that it does for your workforce and everything else. So we look forward to seeing you on those. And again, thank you very much. If you guys have questions, please email or put it in the chat. And if you'd like to see topics down the line throughout the rest of this year, please let us know as well. We're open to suggestions, and we're molding this to help you. So again, we appreciate it, and have a great rest of your week.